Welcome to Paranormal Northwest, a podcast all about the history and the paranormal of the Pacific Northwest. Join me as I tell stories of this great region, the history, the people who live here, and those who may have never left. This episode is bringing us back to the state of Washington. Today we are visiting the Northern State Mental Hospital in Sedro-Woolley, Washington. First of all, I want to thank everyone who has been listening and subscribing so far. It's been amazing, and it's allowing us to have advertisers. This is the first episode I've been able to record since acquiring them, but I really appreciate your support. Now, let's get into it. Many images come to mind with the term mental hospital. Often, we have this idea that has been ingrained in popular culture. You know the one: a derelict, dark hospital with locked rooms, secret tunnels, and a staff full of nefarious intentions. But often, mental institutions start with some of the best or better intentions. Unfortunately, due to overcrowding issues, many hospitals lack the capabilities to properly care for the patients in them. Let's start with the history of mental illness. There is a ton of information on this subject, which is amazing. I utilize many of these sources, but especially the NOPA project course, History of Mental Illness. It's definitely one you should check out. References of mental illness have been found throughout history, a real mental illness or perceived mental illness based on the society of the time. In the past, uncommon behavior or behavior that deviated from the socio-cultural norms and expectations of a specific culture and period have been used as a way to silence or control certain individuals or groups. Sorry, and that was a quote. I forgot to add quotes. This meant that anything deemed out of the ordinary could get someone classified as mentally ill or even insane. There are three general theories of mental illness: supernatural, somatogenetic, and psychogenetic. The idea of supernatural interference has prevailed in popular culture for centuries, with someone suffering from a mental illness often being deemed possessed. And while the idea of an individual being possessed by a demon may be a simple explanation for some, more modern psychological theories are based more in science. The theory of somatogenetic psychology identifies disturbances in the body caused by disturbances in other body functions due to things such as illness, genetic disorders, and even brain damage. This basically means that mental illness is caused by a biological order or illness. The final theory is psychogenetic. This theory postulates that mental illness sometimes has no or little physical reactions or side effects. Many of the mental illnesses we are familiar with today, such as anxiety and depression, fall under the psychogenetic theory. Today, those with mental illnesses are sometimes still seen as societal outsiders, but at the turn of the 20th century, these individuals were practically banished from society. Many haunted houses have a story of a family member locked in the attic or a room due to being a shame on the family, simply because they had a mental illness. Prior to the practice of psychology in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many people believed that mental illness was a product of supernatural forces and demonic possession. Mental illness was often treated with such extremes as religious intervention. Religious solutions to mental illness were oftentimes locking an individual away who was suffering. It often also involved praying for that person. In some very extreme and very rare cases, an exorcism could have been performed. At the turn of the 20th century, many theories in psychology and ideas around mental health shifted to the physiological approach. This means that many psychologists and physicians looked at the physical makeup of the body and how that could affect an individual's mental health. Some of the solutions that they came up with are quite shocking. Let's talk holes, specifically holes in the head. Now, I'm not talking about adding holes to your own head, which I jokingly say every time I add another piercing to my ears. I'm talking about trephination. Trephination is the medical procedure where a hole is created in the skull by removing a circular piece of bone. Evidence of trephination has been found in skeletons dating back nearly 8,000 years. This idea was and is to adjust the imbalance of humors or energies in the body. The process also allowed any negative energies or even demonic spirits to leave the body. Today, trephination is still used, although in a more precise context. The removal of a piece of skull is used for various skull surgeries and allows for the release of pressure or access to the brain. We often think of extreme treatments to mental illness, made popular in movies and shows such as American Horror Story Asylum. Yes, that is a fictional depiction of a mental institution, but they did get some things right. So, warning, this next section contains sensitive content and that may be disturbing to some listeners. So, what is a lobotomy? Most people have heard the phrase and often think of it as shoving an ice pick through the eye, but that was not always the case and is not always the case. Also called a leucotomy, a lobotomy is the medical procedure that was a form of neurological surgery often used to quote unquote cure a mental illness. The process involves severing the connections to the prefrontal cortex of the brain. The procedure was originated by a Portuguese neurosurgeon named Antonio Egas Moines, who won the Nobel Prize for the procedure in 1949. Moines was a neurologist and believed that mental illness originated from abnormal neural connections to the frontal lobe. At the turn of the 20th century, many psychological approaches looked at the physiology of the brain, making the connection between the physical structure of the brain and mental illness. Moines noted that previous experiments using chimpanzees and the removal of their frontal lobes had made them calmer. He also noted marked personality changes in soldiers who had endured frontal lobe trauma. He hypothesized that removing fibers from the frontal lobe or breaking those physical connections would improve mental illnesses. Moines and his team began conducting experiments on mental patients in 1935. His first patient was a 63-year-old woman who suffered from a series of mental illnesses, including depression, anxiety, paranoia, hallucinations, and insomnia. Over the course of 2 months, the patient was deemed cured of their mental illness. During these experiments, Moines noted approximately 1/3 of his patients were cured, 1/3 had marked improvement, and 1/3 had absolutely no change at all. Initially, the procedure was done using an alcohol that dissolved the brain fibers. After the initial 20 experiments, and I am choosing to say experiments instead of procedures because the patients these were being done to did not have a choice. They were being experimented upon. So after the initial experiments, Moines and his team started using a wire to physically cut the frontal lobes. After these experiments, Moines deemed the results, quote unquote, respectable. He noted that any negative effects of the procedures far outweighed the benefits, and those that were cured. He did note the procedure could only be done to a certain point, with patients who had deteriorated too much not benefiting from the procedure. But obviously, he had to do the procedure on those patients to figure that out. Hence, they were experiments. Moines' work led to his recognition and earned him the Nobel Peace Prize, or the Nobel Prize in Medicine, in 1949. However, I would like to note that his very first patient, that 63-year-old woman who he deemed cured, was never released from the mental hospital that she was in. Throughout the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, lobotomies were standard practice in mental hospitals and institutions. Moines was not the only neuroscientist who had been conducting these and similar experiments. However, these procedures still involved trephination and needed to be done in a sterile surgery setting. This led to some trying different methods that could be done easier and in a less controlled environment, i.e., less medical. In 1945, Walter Freeman began testing a new process for lobotomies. He took an ice pick from his kitchen and began experiments on grapefruit and eventually cadavers. If you don't know what a cadaver is, it's a dead body. Freeman's idea was to limit the additional medical support needed to perform a lobotomy. Instead of drilling a hole into the side of the skull to access the tissue to be cut, he tested going in through the eye socket. This process became known as a transorbital lobotomy. So, some super nerdy bone structure facts. I love the bones of the human body, so much so that I took human osteology twice in college. I find it incredibly fascinating, and I personally think it helps me understand how my own body works even better. If you didn't know, your eyeballs sit in a bone socket in your skull. Yes, most people know it's called an eye socket, but many people don't realize that there is bone behind your eye. There's a thin piece of bone that protects your brain. I am going to, in not super great detail, explain the process of a transorbital lobotomy. So if you're queasy, maybe skip forward a little bit. Sorry. In a transorbital lobotomy, a thin instrument is inserted into the eye socket behind the eyeball. Yes, in his initial experiments with grapefruits and cadavers, Freeman did use an actual ice pick. However, these procedures were usually not conducted with an ice pick, but an instrument called an orbitoclast when they were conducted on living patients. The orbitoclast was inserted behind the eyelid, then hit with a mallet to break that thin piece of bone at the back of the eye socket. Then the orbitoclast was moved in a series of specific movements that were intended to sever those fibers of the prefrontal cortex. If necessary, this was repeated on the other eye socket. The first lobotomy that was conducted on a live patient was in 1946. By 1951, almost 19,000 people in the United States had undergone the procedure. Lobotomies were predominantly carried out on women and sometimes even children. The practice was essentially banned in the United States in the 1970s. Thank you, Jimmy Carter. However, they can still be conducted in an appropriate medical setting if deemed ultimately necessary, which I don't know about you, but that kind of terrifies me. I want to take a look at probably one of the most notable, or to me, or in my opinion, one of the most famous cases of a person undergoing or having undergone a lobotomy. So one of the most notable cases of a lobotomized individual was Rosemary Kennedy. The oldest daughter of the Kennedy family was born in 1918 in Massachusetts. Rosemary was developing slowly as a young child, possibly due to oxygen loss during childbirth. As a child, it became more apparent that Rosemary was mentally impaired, and at age 11, she was sent to a school for the intellectually disabled. The Kennedy family attempted to hide Rosemary's disabilities from the world, often pretending that she was developing at the same rate as other children her age. At age 15, her tutors reported that she was intellectually a 10-year-old. As she continued to grow, her family integrated her into social events, such as meeting the Pope as well as the King and Queen of the United Kingdom. When Rosemary met the King and Queen, she tripped and nearly fell. This incident has been speculated to be a result of her mental disabilities, but was virtually ignored at its time. In 1940, the family became increasingly more worried about Rosemary. She had suffered from seizures and mood swings her entire life and had begun to become increasingly irate and even violent. Rosemary was eventually sent to a convent in Washington, D.C. Her family and the nuns became concerned when she would sneak out at night. Her father was worried about Rosemary's behavior negatively affecting the family's reputations and even her brother's political ambitions. In November of 1941, Rosemary underwent a transorbital lobotomy. Her father did not tell her mother of the procedure until after it was completed. Another side note, if you didn't know, sorry for the language, Joseph Kennedy was a total ass. Yes, he paved the way for his children, but he was not a good guy. And my side note, Rosemary's lobotomy was in fact a traditional lobotomy, not a transorbital lobotomy. During the procedure, they instructed Rosemary to recite some questions or phrases, and once she became incoherent, they stopped cutting her brain. Yeah, I just left that there for a moment for you. Sorry. The procedure was conducted by Freeman and his partner, James Watts. Watts believed that Rosemary was not suffering from mental disabilities as most thought at the time, but instead actually was suffering from depression. However, years later, all of the patients who received the procedure from Watts and Freeman were deemed by them to have suffered from mental illnesses, so they may have been biased. Unfortunately, the lobotomy had been unsuccessful, incredibly so. Rosemary's mental capacity had decreased and was now that of a 2-year-old. Her parents hid her, not just from the world, but also from her siblings. The Kennedy siblings were not made aware of what had happened to their sister or even knew where she was until 1961. 20 years. Her parents hid her from her family for 20 years. Refer to my previous comment about Joseph Kennedy. After their father's death in 1969, Rosemary gradually became more involved with her family. She was, however, still institutionalized until her death in 2005. Rosemary passed away with her surviving siblings by her side. Now let's look at Northern State Mental Hospital. At the turn of the 20th century, Washington State had 2 existing mental hospitals, Western State Hospital in Steilacoom and Eastern State Hospital in Spokane. Both of these hospitals experienced overcrowding. In 1909, a state commission was appointed to select a site in the northern part of the state for a, quote, hospital for harmless insane, end quote. The 800-acre site northeast of the town of Sedro-Woolley was purchased for $75,000. The first building was quickly built in 1910 and was used for planning and administration. Between December of 1912 and January of 1913, the first 200 patients were transferred to the hospital from Western State Hospital in Steilacoom. People in the area called the newly built hospital the Bug House. This was not a term created for the new hospital, but was actually an acceptable cultural term for an asylum. This term was not used as derogatory as we might view it today. In fact, some historians note that the term has often been used with affection when discussing the hospital. At its inception, the hospital was designed to be a working farm colony. The idea was not new, and it would allow patients to be given jobs and be functioning members of the community. This also led to the hospital becoming mostly self-sufficient. Patients were given vocational training on the farm, in the dairy, the printing plant, as well as the other facilities on the property. In January of 1914, Dr. James Doughty took charge of the hospital. Born in Maine just after the Civil War, Doughty initially moved to Tacoma in 1906. He worked as the assistant superintendent at Western State Hospital in Steilacoom for 6 years before moving on to Northern State. In February of 1922, a patient at the hospital was murdered by another patient. This led to the increased need for security on the hospital campus. Side note, I couldn't find any information on the prisoners killing each other, but I did find it mentioned in numerous sources, but I personally couldn't find anything about that. Doughty built up the hospital, implementing modern medical practices with grand plans for the hospital. However, all of his plans were canceled due to the stock market crash of 1929. Doughty was removed from the hospital in 1930 due to the governor of the time minimizing state institutions. But with a new governor, Doughty was reinstated as the head of the hospital in 1933. Under Doughty's care, Northern State Hospital was the most modern of Washington State's 3 mental institutions. Doughty was successful in acquiring bonds for the hospital improvements. He also wanted to improve the practice of medicine in the region and was able to institute a nurse training program on the hospital campus. At the end of World War II, Doughty slowed down and retired. On January 1, 1950, his replacement was a younger doctor named Charles Jones. Jones had already been making waves in the mental health community, particularly for his work with Walter Freeman on the transorbital lobotomy. Yep, we're going to go there. He was a Washington State native as well as having served in the United States Army in World War II. Jones served as the hospital director from 1950 until 1960. During that time, he added a nurse's dormitory and a theater. He was also adamant that the hospital be one of the best psychiatric facilities in the world. He also insisted on treating those sent to the hospital as guests rather than patients or prisoners. The goal of the hospital was also to rehabilitate and eventually discharge the patients. Even though the hospital was designed to be self-sufficient, the intention was never for it to become a permanent home for the mentally ill. Often, the goal was to work with those individuals sent there to help them become, or go back to being, functioning members of society. As of 1953, the hospital has 2,200 patients and had 415 employees. Many of those employees also lived on the campus. At this time, Jones noted that the buildings were already filled to capacity. Over the years, the state acquired even more land for the hospital. This land was used for additional buildings, but was primarily used for farming. There were gardens and even greenhouses. All of these aspects require a lot of work, and the patients were supervised in their work on the grounds. Some of the other things that patients did on the campus, in addition to farm work, were woodworking, printing, shoe repair, cabinet work, rug weaving, mattress making, and other handmade crafts. The Northern State Hospital was notably more modern than the state's other two hospitals. There were also recreational activities and facilities available to the patients. This was part of Jones' premise that the patients were treated like guests and not prisoners. Within the hospital itself, Jones was determined to approach mental illness with modern practices. His intent was to make the patients feel safe and again not feeling like a prisoner. Even though his relationship to the transorbital lobotomy was controversial, Jones's work allowed the hospital to flourish. Each year he was at the hospital, an average of 650 patients were admitted, with about 400 being discharged per year. Those patients were being subjected to some of the most cruel things that were deemed acceptable medically at the time, things that horrify us today. Things such as the aforementioned lobotomies, forced sterilization, electroshock therapy, and even drugging them to the extent that they were equivalent to zombies. Jones left the hospital in 1960. By 1976, the hospital had to shut its doors for good. One aspect of the hospital that I wanted to touch on was the layout. The hospital itself comprised 4 wards that were connected by tunnels, because, of course, there were tunnels. Of course. This place is the perfect setting for a horror movie. The majority of patients that were housed were not violent. They suffered from things we wouldn't deem as markers of insanity today, such as menopause, depression, anxiety, and even epilepsy. However, the hospital did house a handful of violent patients who were classified as criminally insane. These patients were isolated and kept locked away from the rest of the patients. Due to the sprawling nature of the grounds, patients were allowed to roam, and a few did escape over the years and were never retrieved. So, Northern State Hospital today. Today, the site is known as the Northern State Ghost Town. Ooh. Many of the buildings still remain today, but are off limits to the public. There's also an extensive trail system that takes visitors through the farmland and past the remaining buildings. It is also home to the cemetery, which houses the remains of at least 1,500 people. How did those people die? They weren't the only deaths at the facility, but they were unclaimed. The hospital also cremated patients who had passed, and 204 tin cans of remains were discovered years after the crematorium was closed in 1955. Those also were unclaimed remains of former patients, and notably, and this is probably to me at least the worst part, none of the graves in the cemetery and none of the cremated remains have names on them. If we're lucky, they have patient numbers, but no names. Again, how did they die? Some of these patients died from things such as old age and disease, while others did die by suicide. Unfortunately, some patients did die during botched medical procedures, especially during Dr. Jones' tenure. This was the golden age of the transorbital lobotomy, and having a pioneer of the procedure in charge of the hospital most likely means they were conducting their fair share of lobotomies. So, is it haunted? Of course it's haunted. It's an abandoned mental hospital. Over the years, there have been many stories of ghostly activity at the abandoned site. One common apparition that just seemed to keep popping up everywhere I looked was a young girl with a red ball and a man that appears to be searching for her. I got questions like, why does she have a ball? Was she a patient? Was she the child of someone who worked on the campus? Because they lived there too. Why is the man searching for her? Why does he seem to be searching for her? Did they both die at the same time from an incident? I couldn't find any of that. I just have more questions. But all I gotta say is ghost children are creepy. gotta say, ghost children are creepy. Rather not see a ghost child, but personal opinion right there. There are also reports of multiple nurses being seen or even heard, as well as a nurse that is seen pushing a man in a wheelchair. So you get 2 ghosts for the price of 1 for that one. It's pretty cool. Visitors to the site also experience cold spots, as well as the feeling of being watched. But I mean, if you live in Western Washington, it gets cold. So I don't know about cold spots, but it can get cold. There are also voices. Visitors hear disembodied voices, as well as moaning and even screaming. I don't know. I don't know which is worse, ghostly screaming or ghost children. I don't really want to see either or experience either, but just, I don't know which is worse. I can't leave this episode without noting that my favorite ghost hunters did do an investigation at Northern State Hospital. So I'm not going to do a full recap, but just a couple points. They were asked to investigate by the site manager at the time in order to debunk the claims that the hospital was haunted, because people kept hearing these stories and the buildings were getting broken into by people who wanted to investigate. And I would also like to note there are signs all over the place saying don't go in the buildings, no trespassing, the buildings are falling apart. Please don't go in the buildings. Look at from the outside. Look from the pretty trails. Don't go in the buildings, which they did note in the episode. A few other things. This was really cool. They were able to record what seemed to be a woman's voice humming or even singing. Pretty creepy and eerie to hear, but also super crazy cool. They also captured some sort of form thing, possibly a humanish form peeking out of the darkness. Also cool, but I'm more impressed by the disembodied voices as much as they freak me out. So overall, it's a great episode and you can watch it online for free. I'm sure just Google Northern State Hospital Ghost Hunters. It was pretty good. It's only about 20 minutes too. It was a short episode. So thank you for joining me. That's a wrap on Northern State Mental Hospital. Join me next time as we travel north of Washington State again. I'm not going to tell you where this time, but just saying we're going a little farther north. So please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and follow us on Instagram and Facebook at ParaNWPod. Until next time, bye.